Hello, I'm Zakins. Welcome to Outside Source. Across the hour, we'll be bringing you up to date with the coronavirus outbreak. We'll be starting in Italy, where, those are the titles of the programme, but I was hoping to show you pictures from Italy because the death toll there has gone past 600. More than 10,000 cases have now been recorded. Travel's being restricted across the whole country, and public gatherings are forbidden. In the UK, we know that a man in his 80s has become the sixth person to die from the coronavirus. We'll also be looking at the situation in China because look who's been visiting Wuhan. President Xi trying to send a message to the world that he can visit the epicenter of this crisis, suggesting that he very much has it under control. We'll also be reporting from the US. Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden have now cancelled rallies because of the coronavirus, and we'll be asking why have the Americans been testing at a rate much lower than a number of other countries. Now, this graphic from Johns Hopkins Coronavirus Research Center shows the number of cases of the coronavirus outbreak across the world. It now stands at more than 118,000. More than 4,200 people have lost their lives. Countries such as Lebanon, Morocco and the Democratic Republic of Congo have reported their first cases. Others have announced border closures and travel bans. Across the next hour, we'll bring you updates from France, Germany, the UK, Austria, Spain, Iran, the US, the Maldives, as well as a number of others. But we're going to start in Italy because it's just ending its first day under quarantine. Its numbers for this crisis continue to increase. Over 10,000 cases have now been recorded. 631 people have died, and the impact of these new measures have been felt all over Italy. Just look how quiet the roads are close to the Colosseum in Rome. People have been told to stay at home unless absolutely necessary. These are the streets leading to the Vatican. You can see St. Peter's there in the background. This area would normally be teeming with tourists. Not today. And bear in mind, public gatherings have been banned in Italy. Next, much further north into Milan, where again this would be a hugely busy location. Today, just about deserted. We've been told the metro and the roads in Milan are also quiet. There are so many examples I could show you. One more from Bologna, where the main piazza again is incredibly quiet except for policemen and some military personnel. Well, let's visit Bologna as our first stop now. The BBC's Bethany Bell is there.
People are moving around in the town of Bologna today, which they are allowed to do under this decree if they keep a safe distance for each other, although the government is urging people to stay at home as much as possible. In other towns close to here, which have been more impacted by the outbreak of the coronavirus, the streets are much more deserted. I was speaking to a woman in the town of Piacenza, which has had a spike in the number of cases. She says there the streets are deserted and all you hear is the sound of ambulance siren after ambulance siren. And people here in Bologna are telling me, they're very worried about what the impact of this will be on their businesses, whether they'll be able to keep paying their employees. Others say maybe we did this all far too late. Others saying possibly this is a bit of an overreaction, but a strange, strange time for people here.
Well, from Bologna, let's move to Bergamo, a city at the heart of this outbreak, just to the northeast of Milan. The hospitals there are under severe pressure. Just listen to the experience of one surgeon.
We are facing, which are what I call it a kind of wartime. I think nobody could imagine this kind of crisis. We are still observing a steep increase in the curve of the new cases day by day. And now we are beyond the 50% of ICU beds occupied with these patients. And things are getting worse and worse for physicians, nurses as well, because we are as well in a shortage of people, because they are becoming infected day by day and they have to stay at home in quarantine. Our hospitals are a hospital in a kind of war.
Well, these new quarantine restrictions do not allow travel unless it's for urgent family, work or medical reasons. The trains and buses are still running, but if you use them, the advice is you have to keep your distance from others. All of that's designed to keep people safe, of course, but inevitably all of this is creating a great deal of anxiety too. Here's one woman in Bologna.
I can't tell you how scared I am. I live alone, so I try to do what I can to keep myself healthy. I'm trying to avoid the virus, but how can I do that?
We've also heard from Pope Francis, who's been detailing how priests will visit people to offer comfort.
Anche per I nostri sacerdoti.
Let us pray to the Lord also for our priests. May they have the courage to go out and see the sick, bringing them the strength of the Word of God and the Eucharist, and accompany health workers and volunteers in the work they do.
Well, one other important detail, there are of course huge financial pressures being exerted on many Italians because of what's happening. And today, Italy's Deputy Finance Minister said mortgage and tax payments will be suspended while the restrictions are in place. And while we've been covering Italy, one question keeps coming up. Why is this outbreak so much worse in Italy than anywhere else in Europe? Well, here's the BBC's health correspondent, Fergus Walsh.
They had poor surveillance early on. The virus was circulating silently for weeks, and they've been playing catch-up ever since. Lots of transmission happens in the home, between generations, and that puts the elderly at risk. And Italy has the second oldest proportion of elderly in the world. Now, we keep saying this is a mild illness for 4 out of 5 people, but when you have thousands of people infected and you can multiply the official figures by tenfold or more, then you get a massive impact from the minority. And it's really sobering to read the accounts of doctors in many hospitals where they say their critical care units are being overwhelmed with patients with pneumonia, breathing difficulties, they don't have enough ventilators, and they're setting up makeshift intensive care in corridors.
Well, as this virus has spread through Italy, so has misinformation. This doctor in Venice has been, actually it's not there what I was going to show you, but it's been highlighting the fact that leaflets have been distributed claiming to say that this virus has been coming not because it's a reasonable health emergency, but because a vaccine exists, and all of this has been created in order to create profits for Big Pharma, which of course isn't true. Well, let me bring you up to date with this from my colleague from BBC Monitoring, Olga Robinson, who's been looking at this issue.
There was at least one example that we've seen recently that showcases how misinformation can spread offline rather than online. But apparently there's no evidence to suggest that any vaccine exists, and we know for a fact that it does not exist. And apparently, according to the latest media reports from Italy, the suspected person behind the leaflets has been arrested.
It's interesting you mentioned this idea that the virus has been created to further some cause, because I wonder if this is what you've seen, but I've seen quite a few examples of this in different forms, people saying this has been created for this purpose or that purpose.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of conspiracy theories that have been flying around, and they literally spread like wildfire across various countries. And sometimes they even use the same wording but just different language. One of the very popular conspiracy theories talk about a Big Pharma conspiracy that suggests that there is already a vaccine, and it was created specifically to essentially get all people vaccinated, or a certain number of people vaccinated against the virus, control the population. There's also been suggestions that it's a bioweapon of sorts, and we've even seen really obscure links suggesting that the virus has been predicted in a book from 1981.
And of course, there's no evidence to back any of that up,
No.
but it's still being widely shared. So where do the big tech companies fit into this? Will they get involved in trying to stop the misinformation?
They have been trying to curb the spread of misinformation about the coronavirus recently. In the past few weeks at least, at the very start of the outbreak, you could still find easily quite a lot of misinformation. But now if you type the word coronavirus on Facebook or in Google or YouTube and Twitter, what you will see in the first results will be information from WHO or your local health authorities. So they have been promoting legitimate advice and giving it prominence over misinformation. It literally is quite difficult to find misinformation just in the search results, but some people do still manage to do that.
Thanks very much to Olga. Just to remind you that both Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden have cancelled rallies on a day when some states will be voting on the Democratic presidential nominee out of concerns related to the coronavirus. Now, one question which comes up a lot at the moment is why is the rate of testing in the US for this virus so much lower in the US than it is in other countries? At the weekend, President Trump said this.
Anybody that needs a test gets a test. They're there. They have the tests. And the tests are beautiful.
The thing is, Vice President Pence had already said this.
We don't have enough tests today to meet what we anticipate will be the demand going forward.
Now here's the historian and columnist Max Boot tweeting, "My son played basketball with a friend who had a high fever. Is he suffering from coronavirus? No one knows because almost no one can get tested." And he's written about his frustrations about this in the Washington Post. And this article details how South Korea, with a population of over 50 million, has conducted close to 200,000 tests. He then cites research that could only confirm close to 1,900 tests in the US, and that's out of a population of over 320 million. You could also look at this graphic from Business Insider. It compares 8 countries. It says, for example, Italy has tested 826 people per million. In the US, it's 5 tests per million people. Now, that figure comes from the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC as it's known, but it doesn't include all facilities. So, in theory, the testing rate could be higher, but we don't know. In fact, the government doesn't know. Here's the BBC's John Sopel highlighting an important point. John says that the US has a health sector, not a health service, which is why you have the US Health Secretary saying, I can't give you a number of how many Americans have received a test because many receive a test through hospitals or public health labs. Now that's true now, but it's only become true recently. A former US Food and Drug Administration official tweeted last month, since the CDC hasn't authorised public health or hospital labs to run the tests, right now it's the only place that can do it, so screening has to be rationed. Now let's be clear, American states have now been authorised, millions of tests are being prepared, but that doesn't fix the original problem. Have a look at what this virologist from Columbia University had to say. I think we could have probably controlled this if we had effective testing, and many experts would argue there just hasn't been, whatever the president says. And this is Donald Trump's challenge. A man who rose to power by often placing polemic, passion and identity above being truthful or accurate is now faced with a virus which is oblivious to his attacks and distortions. I was mentioning John Sopel, our North America editor. This article from John is excellent. It argues this may be President Trump's greatest test yet. And we should add that while the White House says the president has not been tested for the virus, that fits with the situation for the vast, vast majority of Americans. Well, we heard from the president a short time ago.
We're prepared and we're doing a great job with it, and it will go away. Just stay calm. It will go away. We want to protect our shipping industry, our cruise industry, cruise ships.
Well, speaking of cruise ships, one is docked in Oakland. This is the one that's been in the news the last week. It's called the Grand Princess. It's been kept off the coast of San Francisco for 5 days because 21 people on board had tested positive. Now it's docked. Most of the passengers who get taken off will be quarantined in military bases. Some will require immediate medical attention in hospitals. Let's speak to Chris Buckler, who's with us from Oakland. Chris, help me get a handle on this. How many people are still on that boat?
Yeah, so hundreds have now come off, but we understand that there's something in the region of between 1,500 and 2,000 still on board. Now, many of those who left were Canadians who have been returned to their country and also Americans. Many of whom now have been taken to these military bases where they will have to spend 14 days in quarantine. Next, it is going to be the British passengers who are taken off, and we understand that they are preparing to leave the cruise ship at this moment. The UK has now planned to arrange for them to head home. We understand they're going to leave here and they're going to fly local time around 9 o'clock tonight and are expected to arrive back on Wednesday afternoon in the UK. And that whole process is beginning now. But you do get a sense just that this is taking a lot of time. There's some suggestions all disembarking all 2,400 passengers won't take place by the end of today. It could well go into tomorrow, maybe even into tomorrow night. Beyond the passengers, of course, there is now real pressure on the companies who operate cruise ships. We've had 2 very, very high-profile outbreaks of COVID-19 on board ships, and as a result, the American authorities are putting pressure on those businesses to ensure that they have got methods of addressing problems should they arise on board ships and try to ensure that the coronavirus doesn't spread.
And Chris, just quickly, what's behind the boat that we can see behind you? What facilities have had to be set up on the dock?
Yeah, you might just be able to see a little bit of it to the left of you of your screen on the boat, but there are tents that have been set up there. There are medical screening facilities that have been set up, and as people are coming off the ship, they are being screened. Now, that's not quite the same thing as being tested for the coronavirus, but they are being checked for their health, checking to see if they have got symptoms. But the sick passengers, they were the first to leave the ship. They've already been taken off and they've been taken to hospital. Ambulances were at one stage standing by there ready. But they are still checking passengers. Such is the concern about this virus and it's spreading once these passengers leave here. Just a word on the British passengers. They aren't going to go into quarantine like the American passengers are. However, they're being told that they are required to isolate themselves for a period of 2 weeks. Basically, that means they go home and they stay away from people to try and stop the spread going into the community in the UK.
Chris, thank you very much indeed. Well, we're going to stay in the US because this isn't just a health story, it's not just an economic story, it's a political story too, because the Democrats are holding primaries today, and we've had an update in the last half an hour. Bernie Sanders has cancelled a major rally in Cleveland, Ohio. This was going to be the first. This is now the first major event of the campaign to be called off because of the coronavirus. The campaign is saying, let me just bring up the relevant quote. We are heeding the public warnings from Ohio state officials. We have communicated concern about holding large indoor events during the coronavirus outbreak. And we've seen this from Joe Biden's communications director saying, in accordance with guidance from public officials and out of an abundance of caution, our rally in Cleveland, Ohio is cancelled. We will continue to consult with public health officials and public health guidance and make announcements about future events. Well, Gary, we've been talking about how there was a political dimension to this story anyway, but this is becoming a practical political dimension now.
Yeah, Ohio actually declared a state of emergency a couple of days ago because they had 3 confirmed cases of COVID-19. And I think what you're seeing here is the campaigns in some ways bowing to the inevitable, particularly with these large indoor events that they hold, thousands of people all stuffed into a room, and actually, Ros, for hours on end, because you have to arrive really early. There's then a whole kind of warm-up situation with various speakers. You know, it's not just in and out. You're in amongst those people, those thousands of people, for several hours at a time. And I think certainly once the Sanders campaign did it, the Biden campaign probably had not much choice. Ohio isn't actually voting today. It's one of the big, crucial states, not just in the general election, but in the primary, that votes a week today. So it'll be interesting to see what effect it has on the actual primary voting process itself for those big states like Ohio, Florida, Arizona, Illinois, which go in a week's time.
Gary, is anyone asking questions about the practicalities of voting? Because I appreciate a rally is busier than a polling station, but some polling stations on Super Tuesday had hundreds of people.
They did, and of course in some polling stations there were queues, weren't there? So, you're standing around in a group of a large number of people in a sort of static way for a long period of time. You go in, you're handed stuff, you touch the voting machines where there are voting machines, etc., etc. So there's a bunch of potential problems. There are the pens, even in some of the places. People pick up a pen to fill in their ballot paper, put it down again. There's not really been much discussion at this stage about whether or not to sort of curb that process. Bear in mind, there's been a general reluctance here from the White House downwards to rush into any particular kind of widespread public, sort of isolation or quarantine measures. We'll see how the numbers go in the coming days, but at this stage there's a lot of resistance. Also, really interestingly, and there's not much polling on this, Ros, but there is some, that the coronavirus does look like a political issue, in the sense that if you ask questions like, do you think it's a big problem? Do you think it's contained? It all seems to split down Democrat-Republican lines. Much more concern about it, about the way it's being handled, about even the risk of it among Democrats than there is among Republicans. Isn't that fascinating?
Very interesting, and we'll see if that maintains as the virus continues to spread. Gary, thank you very much indeed. Well, yesterday we began the programme focused on the markets because they had their worst day since the crash, the global financial crisis of 2008. Well, today been a little bit better. It's been volatile, but generally stocks were in some type of recovery mode. Here's the Dow Jones. It initially rallied. This represents 30 of America's biggest companies. It was down nearly 8% yesterday, but much more positive territory today, up nearly 5%. Then the S&P 500, which represents 500 of the biggest companies in the US, it dropped very sharply yesterday, again has recovered some of those losses, just like the Dow Jones. It's also bounced back by nearly 5%. Well, Michelle Fleury is live with us from New York. Help me out here, Michelle. Now, if shares go down and they stay down, that's very serious. If they go down but they go back up almost as much, is that just standard volatility or something more fundamental?
I'd say there's nothing standard about what we're seeing at the moment, the kind of scale of these big swings on a day-to-day basis. And if you look more broadly, we've been throwing out terms like corrections. There's been talk about bear market territory. That refers to sort of how far you are down from the most recent peak on the stock market. And if you look back at a period of a month or longer, that's when you start to sort of zoom out and see the bigger picture, and you can start to tell whether or not these valleys and peaks are in fact something more significant. One thing that isn't in doubt is that investors remain susceptible to every headline we're getting at the moment on coronavirus. They are very anxious about what it will do to the global economy, what it will do to company profits. And we've seen that again today. What was behind this bounce back was all of this talk from the White House and Donald Trump last night, basically saying that his administration was hoping to come up with a kind of fiscal stimulus plan soon. Those details we still haven't got yet, but that really was behind that sort of halving of Monday's losses, which again you may recall was a pretty torrid day.
I do. Michelle, thank you very much. Very useful. As Michelle in New York. Now, staying on the east coast of the States, the International Monetary Fund is calling on governments worldwide to come together to tackle the crisis and to deal with the economic fallout that is inevitably coming. Its chief economist has been talking to the BBC.
I would like to see countries urgently moving and doing substantial targeted stimulus. Now, even if they don't all announce it at the exact same time, I think it's very important for them to do it now and to do it quickly. And that's going to have a big confidence effect on the global economy. Firstly, I would say on health spending, do whatever is needed. It's important to protect people and their health. When it comes to firms and workers, you have to provide stimulus in the form of cash transfers, unemployment insurance, tax relief. These are targeted measures. Some of them will be temporary, but they have to be done now.
And we also saw an emphasis on how we have to distinguish between what's happening now and the 2008 global financial crisis.
This is not that. This is a health crisis which, if tackled well, should be transitory in nature, and the global economy should be back on track if we can put the right stimulus in place.
Now, the BBC also spoke earlier today to one of the world's most famous investors, Mohamed El-Arian. He was asked if a recession is now inevitable.
I think it's inevitable for countries like Germany, Italy, Japan, that started out with fragile growth momentum to begin with. The US can avoid it, but I think it's a 50-50 right now.
Well, he was also asked if countries are responding quickly enough.
So we've gone from total complacency. Look at the G20 meeting, which was just a few weeks ago, that basically didn't discuss in any detail what the scenario analyses were, what were the contingency measures. So we've gone from complacency to massive catch-up. It's taken us time, so it's a race. And what we're seeing in Italy confirms that we are still behind, but at least we're trying to catch up.
Well, we've talked about investors, we've talked about traders, we've talked about Italy, we've talked about American politics. Next, let's talk about the airline industry, which is under severe pressure. These kind of videos are becoming more common. These are so-called ghost flights with hardly anybody on board. The airlines are doing this to comply with European laws, which say they have to run 80% of their flights to keep their slots at airports. Without those slots, you don't have the right to land or take off at certain times each week, and that has a huge value, of course, to the airlines. Whatever the reasons behind it, clearly these ghost flights are not a great thing to be doing, and the European Union now says it wants them to stop.
We want to make it easier for airlines to keep their airport slot, even if they do not operate flights in those slots because of the declining traffic. This is a temporary measure, and this temporary measure helps both our industry, but it also helps our environment. It will relieve the pressure on the aviation industry and in particular on smaller airline companies.
Now, while there are ghost flights happening, airlines have also just been cancelling thousands of flights. Here's a chart from the website Flight Radar 24. The blue line is 2020. The green line is the average number of global flights in 2019. And you can see the blue line dropping as we head into February. And actually, February was 4.3% down on February of last year. And just today, there have been more cancellations. Here's Tom Burridge.
In recent weeks, a lot of airlines in Asia taking a hit because of the situation in China. What we're now seeing really is airlines closer to London in Europe really taking a hit. So pretty much most airlines are now cancelling all flights to and from Italy and a lot of domestic flights in Italy. For example, Ryanair, Europe's biggest low-cost carrier. And you've had airlines today like Norwegian Air saying they're cutting 15% of their schedule over a month period, and they're going to temporarily lay staff off. You've got British Airways emailing staff today saying basically asking any of them if they want to take voluntary unpaid leave. So I think the impact really is coming home to roost.
We'll have a lot more on the coronavirus in the coming half an hour. But next on the BBC News Channel, here's the latest weather with Chris Fawkes. Hello, I'm Mozakins with Outside Source. We're bringing you right up to date with the coronavirus outbreak in Italy. Well, it's the first full day where the whole country is being quarantined. The death toll's now past 600. There are over 10,000 cases. Transport's now being severely restricted and public gatherings are forbidden. Here in the UK, a man in his 80s has become the 6th person to die from the virus. The outbreak began in China, of course, but there's been a big push by the Chinese today to say we are now on top of it. President Xi has visited the epicenter of the epidemic, Wuhan. And in the US, Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden have both cancelled rallies ahead of Democratic primaries because of the virus. More than 110 countries and territories have now got confirmed cases of this virus. Let me bring you up to date on a number of them. In Spain, there are now over 1,600 cases. That's 10 times more than a week ago, and 35 people have died. Various measures are being introduced. Schools in several regions have now shut. All La Liga games and Barcelona's Champions League game against Napoli will be played behind closed doors. Plus, a senior figure within the far-right Vox party was diagnosed with the virus, so Parliament has been suspended for at least a week. Now, I'm sure you'll remember that hotel in Tenerife in Spain's Canary Islands, which was quarantined for 2 weeks. Well, that lockdown's now over. Here are two of the British guests.
Relieved that at last we're going to get to go home, but we cannot thank the people here enough. They have been absolutely fantastic. They've looked after us very, very well.
Well, from Tenerife now to Greece, because the government has now announced that all schools there and universities and daycare centres will be closed for a 2-week period. Greece has 89 cases and no fatalities. The situation is significantly worse elsewhere. In France, the number of cases is now 1,400, including this man, the culture minister. In Germany, the number of cases is past 1,200. We've seen this hospital set up a drive-through testing point to try and prevent patients from infecting others. As you can see, the test is done through the window of a car. These pictures are from the border between Austria and Italy. The Austrians are saying people cannot move north into Austria without a medical certificate. They're also conducting tests on the border, as you can see. Well, earlier on, we heard from the European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen.
I asked the coronavirus response team this morning to look into further tools that the Commission can mobilize in order to address the overall impact the coronavirus outbreak has on the economy throughout Europe. Many sectors are already suffering, and we will need to look for ways to support them.
Well, from Europe, let's move to Iran. A number of politicians there have tested positive. You might remember this from a couple of weeks ago, the Deputy Health Minister wiping sweat off his face during a press conference about the virus. Later, he was diagnosed, and now we know 30 Iranian officials have this virus. At least 24 of them are members of the Iranian parliament. That's about 10% of MPs. 2 of those lawmakers have died, and all of that is raising concerns that the spread of this virus is much worse in Iran than's been reported. There's been an interesting intervention by Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, the former president of Iran, who today says the World Health Organization must immediately identify the lab that produced and spread the virus, as well as the other centers that supported the biological war against humanity. So here we have a former president of Iran spreading very, very clear misinformation with absolutely no evidence to back up the claims that he's making, all of which continues to create concerns that we are not getting a straight picture of what's happening in the country. Here's Majid Afshar from BBC Persian on concerns about the stats in Iran.
This level of mistrust has also led to people not believing the numbers that the health ministry is putting out of the number who have contracted the disease and also of the number who have died of the disease. Some people are putting out reports or numbers of in thousands, while the government is saying it's still around 300, the number of people who have died of this disease. So you see how different reports and this mistrust between people and the government has led to a chaos in the country.
To Africa next. Burkina Faso in West Africa has confirmed its first 2 cases. The Democratic Republic of Congo has confirmed its first case. That means Africa as a whole now has 100 cases in 11 countries, very low compared with Asia, Europe and North America. And of course different countries are using different tactics. Have a look at these pictures from Rwanda, where temporary sinks have been set up at bus stops in Kigali so passengers can wash their hands as they go about their day. Well, let's shift now from Africa to Asia, because in the Maldives, big tourist destination, 6 foreign nationals there have tested positive. 2 resorts are now locked down. We've been talking a lot about cruise ships, haven't we? Well, in Singapore, one called the Costa Fortuna has docked. Passengers have started to disembark. This ship was turned away from Thailand, turned away from Malaysia, despite the fact that none of its passengers, including a group of Italians, had tested positive for the virus. Meanwhile, in China, where of course all of this began, the news is better than it's been. For 5 days in a row, the city of Wuhan, the very centre of the outbreak, has been the only place in China to record any new cases. And just have a look at who's visited Wuhan. Here's the BBC's Stephen McDonnell.
We could well be looking on this in the future as one of the key turning points in the coronavirus emergency, the day that Xi Jinping went to Wuhan. That's because this is a message to all of the people in China that the emergency is pretty much under control. Now, why would they think that? Because China's most important person has just travelled to the most dangerous city here in terms of the coronavirus and the potential of catching it, and images of him walking around the streets, talking to people, will give great encouragement. And I suppose another part of the message is that if President Xi can be at work in those circumstances, well, why wouldn't we also return to the job? I mean, at the moment, as you can probably see here, this is pretty quiet. It's going to be many weeks before anything like normal life resumes in most cities here, but this could be the start of that return to sort of normal work.
Now, next let me update you on the situation in the UK. A man in his early 80s has become the 6th person to die from the virus. The patient, who had underlying health conditions, caught the virus in the UK and died in Watford General Hospital. We know that more than 26,000 people have now been tested for the virus in the UK. There have been 373 confirmed cases, and in the wake of that lockdown in Italy, the government has also upped its travel restrictions with reference to Italy. Here's the UK's Health Secretary, Matt Hancock.
All those returning from any area of Italy must self-isolate for 14 days. This is in addition to our advice that anyone who visited the specific areas of northern Italy, which were originally locked down in the past 2 weeks, should self-isolate for 14 days. We will do everything we can to keep people safe based on the very best scientific advice.
Well, part of the government's plan is to try to limit the number of people who end up in hospital, and that means GPs playing a central role. And to implement that role, they need to be properly prepared to do so with, of course, the correct equipment and facilities. Here's the BBC's health editor Hugh Pym on this.
This is the sort of protective equipment which NHS staff have to wear if they're in contact with patients possibly infected with the coronavirus. Here, 2 nurses demonstrate how it's put on ahead of carrying out a test. GPs are now being sent the equipment for use in their surgeries. One leading GP said they expect many patients to come in, even though those who might have the virus have been urged to stay away and call NHS 111, and that'll mean non-urgent appointments being cancelled.
We do expect cases to rise rapidly over the coming weeks. Practices are routinely doing health checks, assessing people's blood pressure, diabetic control, long-term problems with heart disease and lung disease. Those routine checks will need to stop.
Some GPs have complained they haven't yet received the equipment. Ministers say it's being sent out this week. So, with the spread of the coronavirus, what is the NHS facing up to here, whether it's GP practices or hospitals? One senior health official said today there could at some stage be thousands of cases in the UK.
With a new virus like this, we can expect, if you like, a peak in cases. It has a relatively slow take off at the start, and that's really where we are at the moment. It will start to rise quite sharply.
Jonathan, it's Dr. Mayer here. I can see
GP video consultations like this demonstration will become more common, with many infected patients asked to stay at home and others wanting to avoid visits to the surgery.
We're trying to ensure that we can keep our service running for the patients who need us, and that we can respond as the situation changes.
The NHS care we're all used to is set to change radically for a time as the virus epidemic reaches its peak. The sickest will be prioritised, others will have to wait longer. Hugh Pym, BBC News.
Now, you'll hear a lot at the moment about social distancing. These are measures that restrict where and when we can all gather in order to slow the spread of infections. They can include limiting large gatherings, closing buildings and cancelling events. And right now, some countries are doing it. Italy, for example. Some aren't to any great degree. The US and the UK. The Wall Street Journal's Mike Bird has been tweeting about this, saying, I started off fairly sceptical in Hong Kong's social distancing. I wore masks, worked from home, but wasn't sure how well it worked. It looks like I was wrong. More than half of Hong Kong's 109 reported cases are discharged, and the regular flu season has flattened. We also saw this from Yasmin Serhan from The Atlantic. So far, only one measure has been effective against this virus: extreme social distancing. Then there's also this piece published in The Atlantic, written by an academic at Johns Hopkins University. In the article, he says, the responsibility for social distancing now falls on decision makers at every level of society. Do you head a sports team? Play your games in front of an empty stadium, he says. Are you organising a conference? Postpone it until the fall. Do you run a business? Tell your employees to work from home. And some, it seems, are listening. Here's Joe Pompeo, writes for the Vanity Fair, reporting that all Washington Post employees are being encouraged to work from home. That's according to a memo from the publisher Fred Ryan. So that's businesses, but what about countries? Well, we know France has banned all indoor gatherings of more than 5,000 people. Greece is shutting schools, universities and other education centres. And Italy, as previously discussed, has introduced quarantine restrictions across the whole country. The UK, though, is yet to introduce social distancing measures. Public Health England is saying, if we bring up one of its more recent statements, these measures will only be implemented if a range of experts and scientists, including the UK's chief medical officers, decide they are necessary and proportionate. Well, very well-known sports journalist Paul Hayward has noted football matches in Italy, France, Spain and Germany are either suspended or behind closed doors. Games in England carry on. I'm starting to think we're out of step. He says, as a bloke at Cheltenham, where 60,000 punters are. And whether he's right or wrong, the UK certainly is out of step with some of its European neighbours. This is the Cheltenham Racing Festival where Paul was today. Thousands and thousands of people coming together. This was the English Premier League at the weekend. Again, very big crowds. You may notice that Up here on the sign it says fighting against coronavirus, but not fighting against coronavirus in the way some European countries are choosing to. Well, if that's England, compare that with the situation in Spain, where the UEFA Champions League game in Valencia this evening will be played with no fans attending. Well, we'll have to see if the UK adopts social distancing in the coming weeks. Here's the analysis of Professor Paul Hunter at the University of East Anglia's School of Medicine.
Well, we don't know for certain yet, because to a large extent what will be chosen will be dictated by how the outbreak spreads. But I think it's quite likely that we will see an increase in home working. It's likely that we will see cancellation of major sporting and cultural events, and possibly also closures of schools, so children can look forward to an extended Easter break. Beyond that, it's actually quite difficult to predict exactly what we will see. I suspect there will be some advice for elderly people, people who are particularly vulnerable, that maybe they should also avoid social spaces during the worst part of the outbreak.
Now, there is one thing on which all countries are agreed: wash your hands and ideally avoid handshakes. We've seen what's become known as the Wuhan shake becoming popular, people tapping their ankles together. The Greek Prime Minister has opted for this, a fist pump. Not sure if that's safer, is it? I'm not sure. It's definitely safer than what the Dutch Prime Minister did earlier.
Oh, sorry, dat mag niet meer. Sorry. Nee. Over. Ik wil er nog wel. Zo, ja. Erg, zo'n gewoonte. Ja, dat mag dus niet meer. Op dit moment stoppen we met handen schudden. Dus u kunt voet zoenen, u kunt elleboog stoten, wat u ook wilt. Ik zie op scholen allerlei prachtige varianten op het handen schudden al ontstaan. Maar wij stoppen vanaf vandaag met handen schudden. Oh, sorry, dat mag niet meer. Sorry. Nee. Over. Ik wil er nog wel. Zo, ja. Erg, zo'n gewoonte. Ja, dat mag dus niet meer.
Now, for the next few minutes on Outside Source, we're just going to pause and take on some of the most frequently asked questions that we're seeing about this virus, because there are an awful lot of questions out there, and let's try and see if we can work through some of them. First of all, the number one question is, how do you protect yourself? How do I protect myself? The biggest risk, we're told, is close contact with someone who's infected, and in your day-to-day life, the advice, just to echo what Mark Rutte was saying, is to thoroughly wash your hands with soap and water. If you're coughing and sneezing, to use tissues, and to not touch your face with unwashed hands. Here's one expert on why hand washing works.
These viruses have a layer of oil on the surface. It's what they have to use. It's part of the machinery that they use to get into a cell. And good old soap and water detergent strips that oily layer off, and the virus is inactivated immediately.
Dr. Adele McCormick is a virologist at the University of Westminster. Here she is demonstrating the correct way we should all wash our hands.
Sweating my hands. Take some soap, create a lather, clean the back of your hands, in between your fingers, the end of your fingers, your thumb, again your palms, your wrist and the top of your hand again. Rinse the soap off with water. Turn off the tap with the tissue to prevent cross-contamination. And then you discard of the tissue into a bin.
And along with washing your hands, as I was saying, if you cough, use a tissue and avoid touching your face. That's because coronavirus spreads when an infected person coughs, sending small droplets packed with the virus into the air, and that can be breathed in or can cause an infection if you then touch a surface where it's landed and then you touch your face. Now, you'll have seen images like this from the start of the outbreak. Thousands of people all wearing face masks. The World Health Organization has this advice on whether we all need to be buying them and wearing them. It says if you are healthy, you only need to wear a mask if you're taking care of a person with a suspected infection of COVID-19. If you wear a mask, then you must know how to use it and dispose of it properly. Now, the next thing we should look at is symptoms. Lots of people have been asking, how do I know if I've got it? Well, this virus infects the lungs, so it starts with symptoms such as a fever, accompanied with a dry cough, and that can lead to some breathing problems. We're also told people will experience muscle pains. And if you're wondering if you can carry the virus without showing symptoms, the answer is yes. The Annals of Internal Medicine, a US medical journal, published this research on Monday. It said new evidence by researchers from Johns Hopkins University says that Persons infected with COVID-19 may be symptom-free for about 5 days on average and should expect to experience symptoms within 12 days. Now, people will be most infectious when they have symptoms. But can someone spread this virus even before they're feeling sick? We've seen a lot of you asking that. The answer is, we think it's possible. Here's the study's lead researcher.
That is one of the biggest questions out there for the global scientific community is, what's the role of asymptomatic people? Both people before they develop symptoms who eventually do, but also people who never develop symptoms.
And those of you watching in the UK on the BBC News channel, this is what you should do if you think you have the virus. The NHS says don't go to your GP, surgery, pharmacy or hospital, but in fact contact 111, NHS's 111 service. If that's not available where you are, you can try NHS Inform in Scotland, NHS Direct in Wales. In Northern Ireland, we're told you should call your GP. And at this stage, you might be asked to self-isolate. Now, this is another question we've seen people asking a lot. What does that actually mean? Here's Fergus Walsh.
If you're told to self-isolate, that means staying at home, not going to work, school or other public places. You shouldn't have any visitors.
If you develop symptoms, a fever or cough, then seek advice first by phone. Don't just turn up at a medical centre or hospital.
If you live with others, then you need to stay in a well-ventilated bedroom with the door shut. If you have to share a bathroom, then use it after everyone else. Don't share towels and toiletries. Your waste should be double bagged. If you test positive, it'll be separately disposed of. If you live on your own, you can order shopping online or get friends to help, but they should leave it on the doorstep.
Now, whether you're asked to self-isolate or not, your details may be passed to a local health protection team. They could then test you for the virus at some point, and after that you'll be advised on what to do next, we're told. Next, let's look at how deadly the coronavirus is. Lots of you have been asking about this. Now, the proportion of people dying from this disease appears to be between 1% and 2%, but the figures are unreliable, to put it mildly, because there are so many underreported cases. So while we can say a percentage of the known cases has led to fatalities, there are so many unknown cases. At the moment, that remains a very fluid issue. Thanks very much for watching. We'll return to this tomorrow, of course, in great detail. Bye-bye.